The snowstorm that swallowed Maple Ridge was unlike anything Jack Carter had ever seen. A war veteran turned wanderer, he was just driving home with his German shepherd, Rex, when a flash of color in the park stopped him cold. Beneath a forgotten slide, a little girl clutched a newborn in her trembling arms, both nearly frozen, lips blue, eyes half closed. She looked up once and whispered, "Don't let him find us," before collapsing into the snow. In that instant, something inside Jack, the soldier, the father, the man who'd lost too much, woke again. Who was him? And why was this child hiding in the middle of that merciless snowstorm? Stay with us until the end to uncover what really happened that day. And if you believe no act of kindness should ever go unnoticed, hit subscribe and join us for more stories that remind us there's still good in this world. Wishing you peace, warmth, and faith, wherever you are today. The wind that swept through Maple Ridge that morning had the bite of a living thing, cruel, sharp, relentless. Snow drifted across the highway in great white veils, swallowing everything beyond a few feet of vision. Inside, a weathered pickup truck crawling through the storm sat Jack Carter, a 42-year-old veteran whose silence had grown thicker than the snow outside. The lines on his face were drawn deep from years of battles fought both overseas and within himself. His dark hair, streaked with silver, clung damp beneath a black baseball cap embroidered with the single word veteran. An olive-green field jacket hung over his broad frame, its seams rubbed smooth from time. On the passenger seat, a German shepherd sat alert, Rex, his only companion, the one soul that had never left. The dog's black saddle coat, with tan coloring along his chest and legs, shimmered faintly beneath the dim light, ears erect, amber eyes scanning the whiteness ahead with instinctive focus. Jack had spent years wandering Wyoming's frozen roads, drifting from one small town to another, always moving but never arriving anywhere that felt like home. 5 winters had passed since the crash that took his wife and daughter. 5 winters since laughter last echoed through the cabin he still could not bring himself to sell. Rex had kept him alive through nights of silence and mornings of guilt, the kind only a soldier could know, the kind where survival felt more like punishment. That day, the storm had forced him to take the long road home through the north side of town, past the old North Hill Park. Rex stirred first. His body went rigid, nostrils flaring as he pressed his paws against the window. A sharp bark cut through the muffled howl of the wind. Jack frowned, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, his voice rough, tired. Another bark, more urgent this time. Jack eased the truck to the curb, its tires crunching through ice, and opened the door. The cold struck him like a slap, stealing the air from his lungs. Snow swirled around them in chaotic spirals, the park barely visible beyond a curtain of white. Rex leapt down first, his paws sinking into the snow. Jack followed, boots heavy, the air so cold it burned. The park was a forgotten patch of land, rusted swings swaying, a merry-go-round frozen mid-turn, and a red slide standing crooked like a relic of a happier time. It was the sort of place children once filled with noise, long before the winters grew this cruel. Jack's instincts sharpened. He'd learned in war to listen not just with his ears, but with the stillness between heartbeats. Something was there, something human. Rex's nose lowered, following a scent the storm could not erase. He moved faster, his body cutting through the snow like a shadow until he reached the base of the slide. He barked again, short, sharp, desperate. Jack's boots thudded after him, and when he came closer, the color stopped him cold. Amid the pale snow, a small figure sat half buried in frost, a little girl, no more than 5, dressed in an old beige dress clinging to her body and covered in snow, her tiny frame trembling against the cold. Her bright blonde hair clung wet against her cheeks, her eyes glassy but alive. In her lap she cradled a newborn baby swaddled in a thin beige blanket, the infant's lips trembling, tiny hands curled weakly against the cold. For a heartbeat, Jack could not move. The image struck him like gunfire, too small, too fragile, too familiar. Then, training took over. He tore off his jacket, wrapping both children in its heavy fabric, pressing the cloth close to trap whatever warmth remained. "It's okay," he whispered, voice trembling despite his calm. "You're safe now." Rex lay down beside them, pressing his warm body against the little girl's legs, breath steaming in the air. The girl blinked slowly, as if surfacing from a dream. Her lips parted, blue and cracked. "Mister," she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the wind. Jack leaned closer. "Don't let him find us." The words came out as a shiver, not a plea, before her small body went limp against his arm. Jack froze for a second, just long enough for the old fear to crawl up his spine. He didn't know who him was, but he knew the tone of terror when he heard it. He gathered both children into his arms, feeling their faint warmth seep into his chest, and began moving toward the truck. Rex trotted close, guarding their flank, glancing back into the white silence as though expecting something to emerge. Jack's breath came in bursts, each exhale a cloud of mist. The world seemed endless and soundless, but for the crunch of snow under his boots and the small, desperate heartbeat he could feel against his chest. He reached the truck, slammed the door against the wind, and reached for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter," he said, voice shaking for the first time in years. "I've got 2 minors, 1 infant, both hypothermic. Send an ambulance to North Hill Park, now." The minutes that followed felt like hours. Jack held the children close, rubbing their hands gently to keep blood moving, whispering anything that came to mind. Fragments of lullabies, old soldiers' prayers, things he didn't even remember knowing. Rex sat alert, head turned toward the road, ears twitching at every sound. The siren's distant wail finally pierced through the storm. Relief came slow, like a wound thawing. When the paramedics arrived, Jack stepped back, arms reluctant to let go. They lifted the children onto stretchers, their pale faces illuminated by flashing red lights. "They're alive," one medic shouted over the wind. "Barely, but alive." Jack exhaled, the sound more like a sob than a breath. Rex nudged his leg, sensing the shift. As the ambulance doors closed, something small slipped from the bundle of blankets, the corner of a knitted pink scarf, half frozen and frayed at the edges. Jack bent to pick it up. Beneath the thin crust of ice, 2 faded initials were stitched in thread. E.B. He turned the fabric over in his hands, the letters burning into his mind. The snow stung his face as he stood there watching the ambulance disappear into the storm. He didn't move for a long time. Around him, the park had gone silent again, save for the whisper of the wind through rusted chains. Rex pressed against his leg, tail low, eyes fixed on him with quiet understanding. Jack looked down at the dog, his voice a low murmur carried by the snow. "We owe another child our lives, old friend." Rex tilted his head the way he always did when he seemed to understand more than a dog should. Jack turned toward the truck, scarf still clutched in his glove. The storm had swallowed the park completely, erasing every trace of what had happened. Only the faint outline of their footprints remained, soon to vanish under the falling snow. As he climbed back into the driver's seat, he glanced once more into the white void beyond the windshield. Somewhere out there was the answer to a question that now echoed inside him. Who was him? And why had a little girl been left to die beneath a slide in a park the world had forgotten? Morning came slow to the town of Maple Ridge. The snow had not stopped, only softened into a steady white curtain that blurred the horizon and muted the streets. Inside the small county hospital, the lights burned low, and the hum of heaters filled the silence between heart monitors. Jack Carter sat in the hallway outside the emergency ward, a paper cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hands. His olive green jacket was still damp from the storm, boots streaked with salt, eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Rex lay curled at his feet, tail flicking now and then, ears twitching toward every sound that came from beyond the glass doors. The night had been long, filled with waiting and the dull ache of uncertainty, but now the quiet was heavier, because it meant the storm had passed, and what came next would be truth. The door swung open with a soft click, and a woman stepped out, her presence at once calm and commanding. Dr. Clara Monroe was in her late 60s, silver hair cropped short beneath a navy wool cap, her blue scrubs layered under a heavy cardigan. The lines at her eyes spoke of decades spent under hospital lights and sleepless shifts, yet her voice carried the gentleness of someone who had never learned how to stop caring. She walked with a steady grace, clipboard tucked against her chest, and gave Jack a look that said she had seen men like him before, broken ones, standing too straight to admit it. "Mr. Carter," she began quietly, glancing at Rex, who raised his head. "They're both alive." Jack exhaled, the air leaving him in one long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Clara continued, her voice careful, each word measured. "The girl's name is Emily Brooks, about 5 years old. Severe hypothermia, but she's young. Her body's fighting back. The infant, a boy, we've named him Samuel until we confirm. He's weak, but out of immediate danger." Jack nodded once, unable to speak. He looked toward the frosted window of the ward, where 2 small silhouettes lay surrounded by machines and blankets, and something inside him, some brittle thing, long frozen, shifted slightly. Clara hesitated before handing him a small evidence bag. Inside was a folded, water-stained piece of paper, the ink smeared but still legible. "This was found in the girl's coat pocket," she said softly. Jack opened it carefully, eyes tracing the uneven handwriting. "If anyone finds this, please save my children." Elena Brooks. The words hit like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, the name spinning through his mind like a ghost pulled out of the past. Elena Brooks. He had heard it before, seen the fear behind that name long ago. A year earlier, she had shown up at the Veterans Support Center where Jack volunteered once a week, a young woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a bruise she tried to hide under her hair. She'd spoken in a low, shaking voice about wanting to leave her husband, about how he had started drinking again, about the way his anger filled the house like a storm. She had begged for help, a ride, a contact, anything. Jack had looked away then, muttering something about not getting involved. She'd thanked him anyway and left. He hadn't seen her again until now, in the form of that note written with a shaking hand just before she disappeared from the world. Sheriff Nate Hollis arrived not long after, his heavy boots echoing down the corridor. Hollis was in his late 30s, solidly built, a man who carried the weight of his badge without letting it bend him. His coat was dusted with fresh snow, hat tucked under one arm, and his face bore the solemn look of someone who had seen too many tragedies dressed as accidents. He nodded at Jack, then at Clara, before speaking in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. "We've confirmed the mother, Elena Brooks, found her last night in what's left of her house on Riverbend Lane. The place burned. Fire department's ruling it as an apparent suicide, but..." He paused, rubbing the bridge of his nose. There were signs of struggle, bruising, broken glass. Someone wanted it to look like she gave up. Jack stood still, the hallway tilting slightly around him, his hands clenched at his sides, the paper still crumpled between them. "And the husband?" he asked quietly. "Vince Rooker," Hollis replied, the name like gravel in his mouth. "No sign of him. Neighbors say he packed up the night before the fire. Records show a long history. Bar fights, domestic calls, but nothing that stuck." Hollis looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You knew her?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past the sheriff toward the ward window, where Emily lay beneath the pale hospital light, a small figure lost in white sheets. He finally spoke, his voice low. "She came to me once. Asked for help." The admission hung in the air, heavier than guilt itself. Hollis nodded slowly, understanding without judgment. "Then maybe this time you can help her children." The words were not unkind, but they cut deep. Clara returned a moment later, her tone softening the edges of the truth. "Emily's stable enough to rest on her own. She'll need warmth, food, time. But the kind of healing she needs, that's different." Her gaze lingered on Jack, as if measuring whether the man standing before her was capable of it. Rex pressed his head lightly against Jack's knee, a silent reminder that duty was not always about orders. It was about choice. Jack walked to the window. The glass was cold against his palm. Inside, the little girl stirred beneath her blanket, her small hand resting beside her brother's. The machines pulsed quietly, the rhythm of 2 lives suspended between what they had escaped and what lay ahead. Jack's reflection wavered in the glass, his eyes hollow but burning with something new. Resolve, maybe, or atonement. He whispered almost to himself, "I told her it wasn't my business." The words came out like a confession to no one. But it is now. When he turned back, Hollis was already pulling on his gloves, preparing to head back into the snow. "We'll start with the house, see what the fire didn't take," the sheriff said. "If Rooker's still out there, we'll find him." Clara watched them both, her voice calm but firm. "Whatever you do it before he does." The implication was clear. The kind of man who could make a woman write a note like that wasn't finished yet. The hallway grew quiet again. Jack leaned down to Rex, scratching behind his ear, the familiar touch grounding him. "We're not done, buddy," he murmured. The dog tilted his head, amber eyes steady, as if agreeing. Outside, the storm had begun to ease, but the cold remained, a reminder that some winters last far longer than the season itself. Jack pocketed the scarf with the initials E.B., folded the note inside it, and walked out into the white light breaking through the hospital doors. He didn't look back. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt too large for the small town of Maple Ridge. Snow gleamed along the streets in soft, uneven mounds, reflecting the gray morning light that crept through the hospital windows. Jack Carter stood by the glass, his reflection faint against the pale sky. He hadn't slept. The coffee in his hand had long gone cold. Rex sat near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the hallway like a sentry guarding something precious. The rhythmic beeping from the children's room behind the glass pulsed like a fragile reminder that life, for all its cruelty, still endured. Darclara Monroe entered quietly, her steps soft on the linoleum floor. She carried no clipboard this time, only the kind of gentle purpose that came from years of walking people through grief. "She's awake," Clara said, her voice low, knowing he had been waiting for those words. Jack set the cup down, squared his shoulders, and followed her into the dim recovery room. The smell of antiseptic mingled with the faint sweetness of melted snow from the coats hung by the heater. Emily lay small and pale against the white sheets, her hair tangled against her forehead, her tiny hand clutching the edge of the blanket. The infant, Samuel, slept beside her in a bassinet, breathing shallow but steady, wrapped tightly in layers of soft cloth. When Emily's eyes opened fully, they carried the kind of fear no child should know. She didn't flinch when Jack stepped closer. She only watched him cautiously, as if waiting to see if the world would hurt her again. Clara sat beside the bed and spoke softly, introducing him not as a stranger but as the man who had found her. Jack knelt slightly, keeping his voice steady and low, the way one speaks to someone just returned from a nightmare. "You're safe here," he said. The words trembled, not from uncertainty but from the weight of meaning behind them. Emily blinked, her lips parted, and then, like a flood breaking a dam, the story came in pieces, broken, trembling, yet painfully clear. It had started on the night of the fire. Her mother, Elena, had been packing a small bag while whispering for her to stay quiet. Vince had come home drunk again, louder and meaner than usual. His voice had filled the house like thunder, accusing, shouting, breaking things he couldn't fix. Emily clutched her baby brother as her mother tried to shield them both. Then, the shouting turned into a scream, the crash of furniture, the sharp crack of glass and a flash of orange that painted the hallway walls. Elena had pushed her toward the back door, yelling for her to run. The last thing Emily saw was her mother's hand reaching through the smoke before she vanished in the glow of firelight. Emily's small body trembled as she spoke, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face. He wanted to hurt my brother," she whispered. "I took him and ran. Mommy said the park was safe." Her voice faltered, the last words fading into silence. Clara placed a reassuring hand on the girl's arm, but Jack could see the shadow of guilt that crossed her features, the same guilt that now lived in his own chest. When the story ended, the room seemed smaller somehow, filled with the echo of things that could not be undone. Jack stood there, hands clenched at his sides, feeling the old familiar burn of rage beneath his ribs. Rex, sensing it, lifted his head and let out a low whine that broke the stillness like a prayer. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Nate Hollis arrived to take Emily's statement. He listened without interruption, his pen scratching across the notepad in slow, deliberate strokes. When the girl finally fell asleep, Hollis turned to Jack. "If her story's right," he said, "then Vince didn't just run, he covered his tracks." The two men exchanged a look that needed no translation. They both understood what men like Vince Rooker were capable of, and how far they'd go to keep their secrets buried. The drive to the Brooks residence took less than 15 minutes, but it felt longer. the road winding through acres of frostbitten pines and collapsed fences. What remained of the house stood like a skeleton against the white hills, a charred frame, roof half collapsed, smoke still coiling faintly from the blackened timbers. The smell of burned wood hung thick in the air, sharp and metallic. Hollis walked ahead with a flashlight, his boots crunching through the ash. Jack followed close behind, Rex trotting silently between them, nose lowered, tail rigid. The dog's training came alive here, every movement deliberate, every pause meaningful. Near what had once been the living room, Rex stopped abruptly. He sniffed at a dark stain that marred the snow near the doorway. Hollis knelt down, brushing the surface with a gloved hand. "Blood," he muttered, "older than the fire." A few feet away, Jack noticed deep boot prints leading away from the house, the pattern distinct. Heavy soles, large size, moving fast. He traced the trail with his eyes, following it toward the tree line where the snow grew untouched. "He ran before the fire reached him," Jack said quietly. Hollis nodded, his face hardening. "Which means she didn't light that fire herself." The air grew still, the weight of the realization settling over them both like new snow. They searched what was left of the kitchen, the smell of smoke still clinging to the air vents. Rex scratched at a section of collapsed flooring, whining insistently. Jack crouched beside him, clearing debris until his fingers struck something solid, a small metal box, dented and scorched but intact. He pried it open carefully. Inside were a few melted coins, a singed photograph, and a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky, ink smudged from tears and smoke. "If I don't make it, tell Emily I love her. He'll come back for the children." Jack stared at the note until the letters blurred. He handed it to Hollis, who read it once and swore under his breath. "She knew," the sheriff said. "She tried to warn us." Jack said nothing. The wind shifted, stirring the ashes into the air like a whisper of what had been lost. Somewhere behind them, Rex barked once, a sharp, echoing sound that carried through the stillness. Jack looked toward the horizon, where the pale sun hung low over the snowfields, and felt a clarity he hadn't known in years. He didn't know how far Vince had gone, or what darkness still lingered ahead, but one thing had become certain. He would not let those children face that monster again. They left the ruins as the afternoon faded, their breath visible in the cold air. Hollis carried the evidence bag. Jack carried the weight of what he should have done a year ago. Rex walked between them, ears perked, every step confident and sure. Behind them, the remains of the Brooks home disappeared beneath a fresh drift of snow, sealing the past beneath a quiet, merciless white. The hospital had grown strangely still that morning, wrapped in a hush that felt uneasy rather than calm. Snow had begun to fall again, gentler this time, painting the parking lot in quiet white layers. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly against the sterile air, and the scent of disinfectant mixed with weak coffee from the nurse's station. Jack Carter sat by the window of the children's ward, his rough hands folded together, eyes fixed on the faint reflection of the sleeping girl and the infant beside her. Rex lay close to the bed, breathing evenly, his ears twitching at each passing sound from the hallway. It was the first time in days that Jack had let himself exhale without fear, though even now the stillness felt too fragile, as if it were borrowed from something waiting to break. Clara Monroe moved quietly between the rooms, her scrubs rustling softly as she carried a clipboard pressed to her chest. The gray light outside fell through the window, touching the streaks of silver in her hair. She paused near the nurse's desk, checking the visitor log, and frowned at a new signature written neatly in blue ink. Vince Rooker. She turned, scanning the corridor, and saw a man standing near the far end, adjusting his coat as if he belonged there. He was in his late 30s, clean-shaven, his dark hair slicked back, a pressed gray suit fitting him too well for someone who had come through the snow. His eyes, cold and unblinking, held the kind of calm that only cruelty could sustain. When he smiled, it was polite, practiced. "Dr. Monroe?" His voice was smooth, with the faint rasp of cigarettes and deceit. "I'm here for my children, Emily and Samuel Brooks. Their mother, Elena." He paused, lowering his gaze in feigned sorrow. "Tragic what happened. I've brought all the necessary documents to take them home." Clara's instincts, honed from decades of seeing the masks people wear, stirred immediately. She asked for his ID, her tone careful, professional, and turned slightly toward the nurse's desk to verify the paperwork. Rex moved first. The German shepherd lifted his head, nostrils flaring, a low growl vibrating through his chest. The sound deepened, raw and primal, filling the hallway with a tension that made the air seem thinner. Jack rose from his chair even before he knew why, his body reacting to something beyond logic, the same instinct that had saved him on battlefields. When he stepped into the hall and saw the man standing there, recognition flared in him like heat. Vince Rooker's expression faltered for the briefest second before hardening into something darker. Inside the ward, Emily stirred, her small body tensed, eyes flicking open. The instant she saw him through the doorway, the memory of fire returned like a wave. She bolted upright, clutching the blanket, and screamed with all the strength her tiny lungs could summon. "Don't come near us!" The cry tore through the corridor, echoing against the sterile walls. Rex lunged forward, planting himself between the man and the children, his hackles raised, teeth bared. The growl that followed was no longer warning. It was promise. Jack stepped into Vince's path, voice low but sharp as glass. "That's close enough." For a heartbeat, the hallway froze in the stillness of a standoff. Vince's fake composure slipped, revealing the flicker of fury beneath. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating, but he forced another smile. "You've got it wrong," he said, tone measured. "Those are my kids. I've got the papers to prove it." Jack didn't move. "You've got a lot of things, Rooker, but not your soul." The man's jaw tightened. Just then, the elevator doors slid open, and Sheriff Nate Hollis stepped out, snow still clinging to his coat. The air shifted immediately, authority reclaiming the room. "Vince Rooker," Hollis said, his voice deep and steady. "You're under investigation for the death of Elena Brooks. I'd advise you to stay right where you are." Vince's gaze darted from Hollis to Jack, to the dog now braced for command. He took one slow step backward, his smile twisting. "You people think you know everything," he muttered, and before anyone could react, he turned and sprinted down the corridor. The chase began in an instant. Vince slammed through the exit door, his shoes slipping on the snow-slicked pavement outside. Jack was right behind him, Rex a streak of brown and black against the white. Hollis shouted orders into his radio as he followed, the sound of sirens beginning to rise in the distance. The cold air cut like knives, snow swirling into their faces, but Jack kept moving, driven by something older than duty. Ahead, Vince stumbled across the parking lot, nearly falling before regaining his balance. He glanced back once, his expression wild, animalistic, stripped of charm. They reached the frozen edge of the lake beyond the hospital grounds. The ice groaned under Vince's weight as he tried to cross it, breath coming out in ragged bursts. "You'll never prove it!" he shouted into the wind, but his voice cracked with fear. Jack slowed, assessing the slick surface, while Rex darted wide, circling to cut him off. The dog moved with precision, muscle and instinct honed from years of training, his paws skimming over the snow until he stood directly in Vince's path. A guttural bark split the air, echoing across the frozen lake. Vince froze, hesitating just long enough for Jack to close the distance. The fight was brief, desperate. Vince swung first, a wild punch born of panic, but Jack caught his arm, twisted it sharply, and drove him to the ground. The ice beneath them cracked in protest. Rex stood guard beside them, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling through the stillness. Jack's voice came through gritted teeth, steady and final. "It's over." When Hollis arrived seconds later, the flashing lights painted the snow red and blue. Vince lay face down, handcuffed, breath steaming in the cold. The sheriff read him his rights while two deputies dragged him to his feet. 3 weeks later, Maple Ridge held its breath again, not for a storm, but for justice. The courthouse was packed, the air heavy with whispers and the faint creak of old wood. Vince Rooker sat at the defendant's table, hair unkempt, suit wrinkled, eyes hollow. The evidence against him was undeniable. The note, the bruises, the blood found near the fire, the testimony of a terrified child. Jack sat quietly in the back row, his cap held in his hands, Rex lying at his feet as the verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts, life imprisonment without parole. When they led Vince away, he looked over his shoulder, eyes burning with the remnants of hatred. "You think this ends it?" he spat. Jack met his gaze with calm that came from something deeper than anger. "No," he said softly. "This ends you." The courtroom fell silent. Outside, the first flakes of a new snowfall drifted down, delicate and pure, as if the world itself sought to cover the ugliness of what had been revealed. Jack stepped into the cold, breathing in the clean air, his gloved hand brushing over Rex's fur. Somewhere behind him, the town clock chimed noon, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't echo like grief. It sounded like peace. The courthouse had emptied hours ago, leaving only the sound of wind slipping through the bare trees that lined the street. Winter was breaking, though its chill still lingered in the air like memory. Jack Carter walked slowly toward the hospital that had become a second home these past weeks. The snow beneath his boots was softer now, melting at the edges, and for the first time in months, the gray sky carried a hint of light that was neither harsh nor cold. In the back seat of his truck, Rex lifted his head, watching the familiar building draw closer, tail thumping once against the seat. The dog seemed to know where they were going, as if he too had made a promise to return until all was safe again. Inside, the corridors of Maple Ridge General hummed with quiet life. Nurses moved between rooms with practiced grace, their laughter faint but warm, a sound that had been absent for too long. In the children's ward, two small figures slept side by side beneath matching blankets. Emily's blonde hair caught the sunlight that streamed through the half-open blinds, and little Samuel, swaddled tight, let out soft breaths that came like sighs. Dr. Clara Monroe sat nearby, reading a worn paperback, her glasses slipping to the edge of her nose. When Jack entered, she looked up with a smile that belonged to someone who had seen too many endings and was grateful for one that didn't break her heart. "They're stronger every day," she said softly. "Emily even asked for pancakes this morning. I think that's a sign she's healing." Jack chuckled quietly, setting his hat on the chair beside him. Rex settled at the foot of the crib, curling his body into a protective arc. His amber eyes watched the children with steady calm, the same gaze that had guarded battlefields and now watched over a new kind of fragile peace. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the rhythm of Emily's breathing. There was something steady in it now, something that no longer trembled with fear. When afternoon light filled the room, Emily stirred awake. Her eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the glow, and when she saw Jack, a small smile curved across her lips. She sat up carefully, one hand resting near her brother. "Hi, Rex," she whispered first, reaching toward the dog. Rex lifted his head and licked her fingers, tail brushing the floor in a gentle wave. Then her gaze shifted to Jack. "Hi, Mr. Jack." He smiled faintly. "Hi, kiddo." She hesitated a moment, eyes searching his face as though trying to solve a question only she could ask. Then, in that quiet, fragile voice that still carried the echo of winter, she said, "Do you have kids?" The question caught him unprepared. He looked away, the lines around his eyes tightening. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking the space between memory and answer. He thought of a photograph that once sat on his kitchen shelf, a laughing girl with dark curls, a woman with warm eyes. He hadn't spoken their names aloud in years. After a long silence, his voice came low and rough, yet steady. "I used to," he said, meeting Emily's gaze again. "But now, I think I've got two more." The child's smile widened, small but radiant, and in that moment, the room felt warmer, the air lighter, as though the past had loosened its hold. Dr. Clara watched from her chair, her hands folded over her lap, saying nothing. Some things didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be witnessed. Later, she would tell Sheriff Hollis that she had never seen a man's face change the way Jack's did that day. Not in war, not in grief, but in quiet acceptance. Hollis had nodded, replying simply, "Some battles you don't win until you stop fighting." Within the week, the papers were filed. Clara signed as guardian witness, Hollis as legal verifier, his steady hand guiding the pen across the final line. Jack stood before the desk, hat in hand, his expression calm but unreadable. The judge's signature came last, the ink sealing a promise that felt more sacred than law. The adoption was granted. Jack Carter, legal guardian and father of Emily and Samuel Brooks. Rex wagged his tail as if he understood the gravity of the moment, his low bark echoing softly through the courthouse hall. Jack looked down at the papers, then out the window where the snow was beginning to thaw. For the first time in a long while, he let himself believe in beginnings. When spring arrived, Maple Ridge transformed. The roads were wet with meltwater, the air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and the first buds pushed through the frost. On a quiet Sunday, Jack drove back to North Hill Park, the same road that had once been a line between life and death. Emily sat beside him, her hands folded around the same pink scarf now washed and mended, while baby Samuel cooed softly in her lap. Rex stood in the back seat, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. They reached the park in the late afternoon, the sun turning the snowmelt into glistening pools. The old red slide still leaned slightly to one side, its paint chipped but bright against the green. Emily stepped carefully through the slush, her small boots sinking into the softened ground. She walked straight to the base of the slide and laid the pink scarf down, smoothing it gently. "Mommy made this," she whispered, not to anyone in particular. She said pink means hope. Jack watched her from a few steps away, Samuel bundled in his arms, his small fingers reaching toward the light. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the scent of thawing pine. Rex settled beside them, lowering himself into the damp grass, his head resting on his paws. His eyes followed the children, unblinking, content. Jack knelt beside Emily and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said quietly, "your mom would be proud of how brave you are." Emily looked up, her eyes bright, with that same light that had once refused to go out, even under snow and fear. "She said brave doesn't mean not being scared," she replied softly. "It means doing it anyway." Jack smiled, his throat tight. She was right. For a moment, they stayed like that, man, child, dog, bound not by blood but by the strange mercy that life sometimes grants when it decides we've heard enough. The sun dipped lower, scattering gold across the thawed earth. Samuel giggled, a small sound that broke through the hush like the first bird of morning. As they turned to leave, Emily glanced back at the scarf one last time. It fluttered gently in the breeze, a small patch of color against the world's quiet white. Jack lifted Samuel higher in his arms, and Emily slipped her hand into his. Rex trotted ahead, tail swinging lazily, leading the way toward the truck. Behind them, the park stood silent, not as a place of sorrow, but as a reminder that even in the coldest winters, some things survive. That night, as the lights of Maple Ridge flickered on one by one, Jack stood on his porch, listening to the laughter of the children inside. The stars hung low and bright above the pines, the kind of sky that only comes after long storms. Rex lay beside him, eyes half closed, the steady rhythm of his breathing filling the silence. Jack whispered softly, more to himself than anyone else, "We made it, didn't we, boy?" Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, and for the first time in years, Jack Carter felt the simple, unshakable peace of a man who had finally come home. Sometimes it takes only a quiet act of kindness to change the course of a life. Not grand gestures, not loud promises, just the small, steady courage of those who choose compassion when no one is watching. In a world that can be cold and unkind, there are still people and loyal hearts who carry warmth wherever they go. Maybe that is what true strength really is, to keep giving even after you've lost, to keep believing even when the snow keeps falling. And somewhere in that silence, humanity endures. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what kindness means to you. Subscribe to join us for more stories of hope, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and keep your heart gentle wherever you are tonight.